presence here. And so today we have the honor of to have Professor Blackwood, and she accepted to present, and her research and everything she studies is so related to the theme we chose for this year. And so we are very happy that she accepted our proposal. So Dr. Blackwood received her PhD from Stanford University. Her work investigates the intersections of local, state, transnational, and religious processes with individual conceptions and experiences of gender and sexuality, particularly in Indonesia. Dr. Blackwood maintains an ongoing research program on the social and historical context of female same-sex relations outside the West. This work includes a study of female two-spirits in Native American tribes historically and colonial gender transgressors in Indonesia, as well as a critique of anthropological theories and representations of same-sex sexualities. She has conducted long-term research on same-sex sexualities and female-bodied trans identities, focusing on tomboy identity, female masculinities, and lesbian activist movements in Indonesia. Her research on tomboys and femmes in Indonesia was awarded the 2008 Martin Dugerman Fellowship, a prestigious national award given by the Center of Lesbian and Gay Studies, City University of New York. That research, which is published in Falling into the Lesbian World, Desire and Difference in Indonesia, University of Hawaii Press, 2010, was also the winner of the 2011 Ruth Benedict Award of Outstanding Scholarship of an LGBT topic. Currently, Dr. Blackwood is working on an oral history project focusing on lesbians in San Francisco in the 1970s. This project seeks to understand cultural processes of social change by exploring how a cohort of lesbian-identified baby women created a women's community and a lesbian identity in the 1970s, and how this identity continues to inform and shape their lives as they age. So let's welcome Dr. Blackwood.
It's really nice to be here. I had to come so far, so I really, I really appreciate the invitation. It's always an honor and fun to be able to speak at Purdue and talk about my work. It's like we're here all the time, but we really never get to talk about our work. So, and thank you for all the work that you've done, Sandra, and the rest of the committee putting this conference together. So today we're going to traverse a little bit of history, and social and cultural history, primarily in Indonesia, looking at some of the arts and folklore, and actually media representations in Indonesia, and tie that into gender and sexuality, and how these ideas shift over time. So bear with me as we're going to, traverse a bit of history and different time frames, but I do have some slides to give you some ideas about what I'm talking about. So for this talk, I'm looking at the way sexual and gender identities are constructed in national and regional discourses, and in this case in Indonesia, to see how such discourses are received or enacted or even disrupted. Now my larger work, which Sandra mentioned, the recent book that came out in 2010, asks how individuals come to take up sexual and gender identities and how these are negotiated over time. I look at the cultural and historical context within which individuals are born and raised, and the sorts of discourses they have access to or come across them, and the manner in which they reflect or disrupt dominant gender and sexual identities. So that's my larger work, but the point I hope to make here today is that there's a multitude of social mechanisms and discourses that combine and collaborate to produce certain understandings and practices of gender and sexuality. And these change over time as well, giving rise to new or reimagined identities. And I'm going to try to show that today by looking at some of the different art forms and literature in Indonesia and how that affects tomboys who are an alternate gender in Indonesia. Now, let's see here. Just to give you an idea of, in case you're not as familiar with Southeast Asia, but this is Indonesia, the islands of Indonesia, all in the lighter brown. And where I did my research was in Sumatra. This is the island of Sumatra, and I was particularly in West Sumatra, in the town of Padang. So the research that I did focuses on tomboys who were living in this town of Padang. Now that's a large town of over or close to 1 million people, but their lives were a little bit different than the lives of lesbians in Jakarta, for instance, of individuals that are born and raised in really highly urban areas. So what I'm going to be talking about applies particularly to individuals who identify and act like men and call themselves tomboys. But that's not the way all lesbians, just to say it generally, identify in Indonesia. Since the 1960s, contemporary Indonesian discourses have created an image of an innate gender that situate women within the domestic domain doing wifely things, and men who are positioned as heads of households and active leaders in the public domain. These discourses set the norms for two distinct, socially defined categories, well known to everybody: women and men. These two are seen as having different and contrastive bodies and natures. This gender binary and its associated ideologies have important implications for sexual and gender identities. And in the case I talk about today, for the particular ways that tomboys and their girlfriends construct their romantic desires. I'm going to come back to this point later, but I should just mention here, and I've mentioned it a few times, that the tomboys are a term used in Indonesia for masculine females who act like, or are said to act like men, or consider themselves like men, and are attracted to and partner with feminine women. We could also call them, I've also used the word alternative gender and transgender, although if I use transgender, then that kind of brings in a whole lot of understandings of what transgender is in the U.S., and it's not exactly the same. So we'll just refer to them as tomboys. Now, since the 1960s, the binary gender discourse in Indonesia has been quite pervasive, but I don't mean to suggest that it's totally seamless or unchanging or rigidly adhered to by everybody. In fact, as Foucault's analysis of power and knowledge suggests, such discourses inevitably produce their alternative. I follow Foucault's insight concerning the importance of discursive practices in the construction of sexual subjects. Now, one of the questions prompted by Foucault's work is what sorts of desires are incited or imagined by what discourses? Now, Ann Stoler, the anthropologist Ann Stoler, who did research in Indonesia and on European colonialism, notes that in Foucault's history of sexuality, desire follows from and is generated out of the power-laden discourses of sexuality where it is animated and addressed. Now, Foucault argued that the deployment of homosexuality and heterosexuality through scientific and medical discourses created the possibility of being heterosexual or being homosexual. But Foucault didn't imagine sexuality outside of or without the categories of man and woman. To rectify that, Stoler insists that sexual desires were structured by desires and discourses that were never about sex alone. It wasn't just about sexual desires without any other understandings. So Stoler demonstrates that desire is not just about sex bodies, it's also about the particular forms of gender, class, and race that those bodies express. So we're not just we don't just have sexual desires, we have desires for people who fit certain ideas that we have of our own gender, of their gender, or of our own class, of our own race, and their class and race. All these things become part of the whole package of sexual desire. So to the extent that Foucault focused attention on discourses of sexual desire, the gendering of those desires were overlooked. In his analysis, the categories of woman and man remained unproblematized, their gender desires unexamined. Now, Judith Butler's rethinking of gender successfully inserts gender back into sexuality studies. Butler writes that gender ought not to be conceived merely as the cultural inscription of meaning on a pre-given sex, just coming after. No, gender designates the very apparatus of production whereby the sexes themselves are established. So we can't have sex and sexual desire without already being positioned in a gender. In line with these Foucaultian critics, I broadened desire's object then to include forms of masculinity and femininity. By so doing, I show how gender desires are produced in and through particular dominant and alternative discourses and gender regimes. Now I'm going to do this in this paper by starting with ethnic Malay folk tales of cross-dressing women, and then I'm going to explore the ways that the Indonesian state transformed these tales into stories that more properly aligned with the state ideologies of gender. These old folk tales, as I'll show you, made gender transgression imaginable. In fact, it was a potent transformation that allowed for the possibility of moving between genders either temporarily or permanently. But in the process of nation-making and nation-building in Indonesia, the possibility of gender transgression represented in these old folk tales was reworked into notions of fixed and binary gender that were then imagined to fit modern state purposes. This new state formulation produced contemporary forms of gender identity, including the perverse gender or queer gender that is expressed by tomboys. That of the female acting like a man, perverse gender. I'll put perverse in quotes. Finally, I'll look at popular media representations of lesbian couples in Indonesia to see how these representations support normative gender and sexuality and still leave room for perverse genders that are culturally intelligible. So let's see. So we're going to look at performance arts on the island of Java briefly. It's the central island of the Indonesian state. And these Javanese wayang, which is shadow puppet play, and I'll show you a clip from one in a minute, has stories that are based on ancient Indian epics. Some of you might be familiar with the Mahabharata and Ramayana. Now these epic stories, ancient stories, are populated with men and women characters who can change their sex. Two of the well-known women characters in the wayang stories are Srikandi and Sumbadra. Here's Srikandi. Wayang kulit, these are puppets that are on sticks that are performed, I'll have to show you in a minute, then you can understand how it works. Srikandi, both Srikandi and Sumbadra are wives of the mythological hero, the archer and warrior Arjuna. Yeah? Now Srikandi is brave, strong-willed, heroic, and active, while Sumbadra is her opposite. She's portrayed as elegant, gentle, reserved, utterly loyal and obedient to her husband, Arjuna. In some of her stories, Srikandi, and here's a more popularized contemporary representation of Srikandi, also as the warrior. She's a master at archery and military skills. She's considered a female warrior. So in contrast to Srikandi, Sumbadra has much less power and is frequently abducted by amorous suitors and has to be rescued by Arjuna. So I want to show you a brief clip of wayang performance, just so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. Now, so those figures are on sticks. These are, okay, going without me. Hold on. Okay. So this is a wine performance. The figures are behind a cloth or a screen, and the dalong, the person telling the story, is hidden actually behind there, and the audience is out here, like where you are. So you can only see the figures behind the screen. This is Arjuna. I know he looks a lot like Srikandi, but this is Arjuna, and this is the monster that he's fighting in this particular story. At first they just talk or argue, and you can only tell that by the arm moving, right? So the monster's talking, Arjuna's listening. These things go on all night long too. Yeah. Okay, so they're establishing that they don't like each other and there's a problem with panic. Now Arjuna's talking. Let me skip forward to some action here. Okay. Now they're fighting. And Arjuna only has to use that little stick because he is so powerful. The monster's always coming at him, but Arjuna's just like... Now the monster has a sword, doesn't matter. So that's the way these stories are told, and like I said, there's a lot of different stories that involve not just Arjuna, but Srikandi, Subhadra, and everybody. Now, in some Wayang stories, both Srikandi and Subhadra change their sex with the aid of the gods. So they are transformed into men and engage in battles, which is always the key element of Wayang stories. And although as women, remember as women, Srikandi and Subhadra are both erotically attracted to and in love with Arjuna, our hero there. But when they are men, they go about abducting women for amorous reasons. So, in one story, Srikandi changes her sex and becomes Kandihawa. This is still Srikandi, but in her male form as Kandihawa. As Kandihawa, he marries a woman named Devi Durniti. And the shaman helps Kandihawa to attain his manhood by exchanging genitals with him. The gods can do these things. So that Kandihawa, also Srikandi, and Devi Durniti are able to have a child. So not only does Srikandi change her sex and become a man, she also marries this woman and has a child with him. So these Wayang stories are cultural legacies that constitute important models for transgressive female behavior. In fact, still today, there's lesbians in Jakarta that my colleague Saskia Vininka interviewed, who were older, who said that when they were little, they were called Little Srikandi because they acted like tomboys. And so Srikandi in her, as the female warrior and in her masculine phase, becomes this role model for young women who are tomboys. So these gender-switching mythological figures reflect a worldview in which the two sexes have distinct physical and behavioral characteristics. But spiritually potent beings can nevertheless transgress these sex-gender boundaries to achieve supernatural tasks and fulfill erotic desires. To act like the other sex or desire the same sex necessitates a gender switch, yet such stories offer the possibility of exceeding the sex-gender binary. You can imagine it can happen. Okay, so now we're going to go to West Sumatra, which, as I said before, is where I did the interviews with the tomboys. This is also where the ethnic group, the Minangkabau, are primarily live or associated with West Sumatra. And here, like other places in Indonesia, state programs and policies are pervasive in people's lives. So whether it's in education or the health clinics or village assistance programs and regional art forms, the state's got its finger in there. So here I want to look at the shifting representations in the arts and literature in West Sumatra in particular to demonstrate the effects of restrictive state policies and Islamic decrees on the artistic representations of gender. And I just realized, I think I forgot to mention that Indonesia is, what, 85–90% Muslim? Yeah, it's the largest country, it's the largest Muslim country in the world. So. And people in West Sumatra are always considered or identified as devoutly Muslim. So the art form we want to look at in West Sumatra is called randai. It's a form of dance drama that's actually originated in West Sumatra and may be unique to that area. Through singing and dance, originally the troops were made up of all males. Through singing and dance, they enact these folklore, old folk stories, including classic Minangkabau folk tales. As far back as the 1930s, every province within West Sumatra had a randai troupe. And because they were all male, the men also played the women's roles. And they were called bujangadis. Well, in West Sumatra it was bujangadi, but in Indonesian it's called bujangadis, which means feminine man, or like girly boy. It's like calling somebody a girly boy. And actually, many of these young men who played the female roles were rumored to have erotic relationships with older men. So let me show you real quick here what a randai performance looks like. Now, it's unique. I think it's unique because they use their cloth skirts for percussion. And it's also, randai combines martial arts along with singing and dancing and telling the story. And the main story is told in the middle of these group of dancers. This was performed at the University of Hawaii. So let me skip forward. Just to get an idea of more of the action. So in that dance troupe, there were both men and women performing, and that has changed from the 1930s to the current day, where women can also perform. Well, what I want to tell you about is this story called The Tale of Sigari Ranti. And this is really interesting. I came across some of these books. This is an old classic Minangkabau folktale. And Sigari Ranti is the daughter of royalty in West Sumatra. Kind of historical story, kind of probably not, but you know, that's how those old folktales are. So there was a version of Sigari Ranti that I read that was put together around 1986, was based on a much older story. So there was a 1986 version, which I'm going to describe, and then I'm going to describe the 2004 version, in which was performed by a Rondai troupe in 2004.
Send two questions.
So in the story of Sigari Ranti, she's trained, like Sri Kandi, in martial arts and mystical knowledge and also womanly crafts. When her father wants her to get married, she declares that she'll marry whoever can best her in martial arts. But after 4 days and many matches, no man can best Sigari Ranti. So she decides to take off on a series of adventures since there's no husband forthcoming. So in the early morning, she slips out of the palace, taking 6 female companions with her, and they all disguise themselves as men. Her father is furious at her disappearance, but because they're so cleverly disguised as men, nobody can find them. So I guess they never thought to look for that. So they have a lot of adventures, but by the end of the story, a handsome prince comes and finds her, convinces her to come home. He, promises to marry her, so her father's not mad anymore. And she eventually rules her kingdom, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So this story was written in 1986. Now I have to point out that most tales are made under specific historical and social conditions and in the service of particular projects or particular ideologies. And this is true of Sigari Ranti. Once it's written, it changes, and it changes to make different points. It changes depending on the current conditions. And in fact, as one Minangkabau scholar said, these stories are never finished. They are always being retold. So the story in 1986 that I read devoted numerous pages to Sigari Ranti's father and his efforts to find her a husband, to her many suitors and their efforts to win her hand, and to the young prince and how wonderful he is. And only a small portion of the story, which was actually one brief chapter, was devoted to these adventures that she and her 6 female companions had, which should have been the height of the action if the protagonist was a man. And most Minangkabau storytellers are eager to talk about men's escapades. Sigari Ranti, however, is a feminine hero who, in 1986, these adventures have to be downplayed because you don't want women thinking that they can run away from home. So the end of the story emphasizes her happy marriage to the prince and her going and living with the prince. Now even this story is different than the one that was presented in a Rondai performance in 2004 in Padang. There's the book that the story was written in. Because after the 60s, the state had gotten very involved in controlling art performances. And they were trying to encourage regional ethnic art, but at the same time, they were not encouraging things that were not, or stories in which men and women weren't properly gendered. So for the Rondai, then, the performance that I saw in 2004 was very different. As you saw, the Rondai performers dancing around the circle and the action then in the Sigari Ranti story was the fighting, when the men are trying to win Sigari Ranti's hand in marriage, right? No, the story actually as presented in 2004 was these men fighting each other to see who would be the strongest and best man to win Sigariranti's hand, and she's over there standing outside the circle watching. And so everything about her, her independence, her strength, her ability in martial arts, her ability to best men, is gone by 2004. So to me, this reinterpretation of the Minangkabau folktale refigures, it conforms to the dominant state ideology, producing a normative view of citizens that orient women's lives to marriage and reproduction. Now, what does this have to do with tomboys? Actually, there have been, despite the intense binary gender, the gender ideology that the state has been perpetrating in Indonesia, there is this proliferation of genders, which Foucault actually signals in his work, in which, because of the discursive explosion around sexuality, and in Indonesia around gender since the 1960s, they not only produce that normative gender, but they produce other genders. And in Indonesia, then we have woman, man, waria, and these are waria in a drag show. Waria are effeminate males. And then also tomboys. Really? So, I'm going to have to really skip here. So what I'm going to suggest is that even though there was this gender norm, tomboys and their partners became intelligible in the media, and this is the story that was in the media, the marriage of Bonnie and Josie. And this is a lesbian couple here who married. So this is Bonnie, who was described as very feminine. And this is Josie, who was described as being masculine and having 75% male hormones. Apparently some expert had confirmed that. And was also called banchi, which was another term for wadia. It's kind of a derogatory term for feminine male. It also applied to females. So, and then in 2001, too, you still have the same kind of representation. So one partner in a lesbian couple is figured as more masculine. Here you have Yani. This was a couple who worked in Hong Kong as domestic maids. And they came home because they wanted to get married. This was Yani, who was obviously looking rather androgynous, and her partner Ike. It's Ike, who's looking very feminine. Now, they ultimately weren't able to get married, but again, this story highlights the possibilities, A, for gender transgression, and for its intelligibility, because there's still a representation of man and woman, despite the fact that they are, that it's a female acting as a man. So in this way, you get a perverse gender that makes sense and is culturally intelligible in Indonesia. Although the dominant discourses about normative gender are broadly acknowledged, as I said, they're not all powerful. So you have arts and literature representations that show other possibilities. Despite the state's significant effects on art forms and literature, you have representations of alternative genders. And these ideas help to shape and continue to inform contemporary sexual subjects and their sexual and gender identities. So despite not fitting normative gender, these couples create meaningful and intelligible relationships through their gender differences. That's all I